Mistwood was a village almost forgotten by time. Its cobblestone streets twisted and turned between rows of old timbered houses, their wooden beams darkened with age and rain. At dawn, a soft mist hung low over the rooftops, curling into the chimneys and spreading a pale silver across the square. The townspeople were few, quiet, and wary, farming their plots, tending to animals, exchanging greetings in voices soft as the wind. Clara had grown up in this village all her life, 17 now, with hair like spun chestnut and eyes wide with curiosity. She had always loved the quiet of Mistwood. Its isolation, she once thought, was protective. The thick forest that bordered the village kept out strangers, and its fog-laden evenings seemed magical, like stepping into a dream herself. But lately, something had shifted. The village had become tense, a nervous undercurrent running through every interaction. People looked over their shoulders when they spoke, their voices lower, their laughter brittle. Strange whispers filtered through the streets, carried on the wind like a ghostly echo. Doors creaked open and shut on their own. Animals skittishly darted along the edges of the forest. The children avoided the woods, hugging their mothers' hands. Clara walked home that evening, the last rays of sun dying behind the gnarled trees. Her coat was drawn tightly around her, and she shivered not from cold, but from the feeling that the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The square was empty except for a lone black cat slinking along the path, its tail flicking like a whip. She ignored it and hurried on. Her bedroom was a small room on the upper floor of her family's modest home, with a single window overlooking the village square. Bookshelves lined the walls, stuffed with leather-bound tomes, journals, and trinkets collected over years of curiosity. A small wooden desk stood beneath the window, cluttered with pencils, notebooks, and the remnants of unfinished sketches. Clara dropped her bag onto the bed and slid into her nightdress, the familiar scent of lavender and wood soot calming her slightly. But the heaviness in the air refused to lift. It clung to her, pressing her shoulders down, making the room feel smaller, darker. The wind outside whispered against the shutters, and she swore she could hear faint footsteps moving along the floorboards below. Tired, she lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, eyes tracing the familiar shapes of her room. Slowly, she slipped into sleep. Clara's dream began gently, like falling into a shallow river, but soon the currents dragged her deeper. She was standing in a forest she had never seen before, the trees gnarled and twisted, their bare branches clawing at a sky she could barely make out. A thick fog rolled along the ground, curling around the roots and twisting in unnatural patterns. The air was damp and cold, and each breath came out in ghostly wisps. She stepped forward cautiously, the ground soft and springy beneath her feet. The forest was silent except for the crunch of leaves and twigs, but she sensed movement, shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, human shapes indistinct and wavering. They seemed familiar, yet wrong. Clara's pulse quickened as she saw one figure step closer through the fog. It was a man she recognized, Mr. Halloway, an elderly neighbor. His face was pale and drawn, eyes wide with terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a whisper reached her ears. "Clara." He stretched out a hand toward her, trembling, and then collapsed into the fog, disappearing completely. Clara's stomach lurched. She wanted to run, to call out, but her legs refused to move. It was as if the forest itself held her captive. The fog thickened, pressing against her chest. Shadows moved in circular patterns, and she saw more faces emerging. Townspeople she knew, Mrs. Langley, the baker's son, even her best friend Sophie. Their expressions were blank, pale, fearful. They drifted like spirits, calling her silently, urging her forward. Clara tried to scream. Her throat tightened, no sound escaping. The forest seemed alive, the trees stretching taller, twisting branches brushing against her skin, pulling her into their gnarled embrace. A chill crawled along her spine as she realized the faces were not just in her dream, they were real people she knew. She stumbled backward, tripping over roots and moss, The mist swirled around her, forming shapes tall, looming, humanoid, reaching with hands she could not see clearly. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as though the forest itself wanted to claim her. Suddenly, a cold wind tore through the trees, carrying a whisper she could not ignore. Next, next, next. Her heart pounded violently, every beat echoing in her ears. The faces of the villagers blurred into the mist, leaving only one figure at the center, a dark, shadowy presence that seemed to pulsate with intent. Clara froze, dread anchoring her to the ground. She felt herself being watched, not by the shadows she could see, but by something beyond, something waiting for her to make a mistake. The forest was a trap, a world built from fear, and the shadows were only the beginning. Clara awoke with a strangled gasp. Her room was bathed in the gray light of pre-dawn. She was drenched in sweat, heart racing, and her blankets were twisted around her body. At first, she thought it was only a nightmare. But then she remembered Mr. Holloway's collapsed figure and the whispering voice. Next, her stomach turned to ice when she heard the news that morning. Mr. Holloway had been found dead in his bed, body stiff and pale. There were no signs of struggle, no illness, no explanation. The villagers whispered in fear and confusion. One by one, more deaths began to follow, each seemingly random, each tied to someone who had appeared in Clara's dream. Clara felt a rising panic. She realized she was not alone in dreaming. Others in the village described the same forest, the same fog, the same shadowy figures. A shared dream, connecting every resident of Mistwood. And the consequences were real, deadly. The quiet, protective village she had always known was gone. In its place was a place alive with fear, suspicion, and a creeping certainty that the forest from their dreams was not imaginary. It was waiting for them, and the next night would bring more death. The morning after Mr. Holloway's death, Mistwood was unnaturally quiet. The sun rose pale and weak, struggling to pierce through the fog that clung to the cobblestone streets. Windows remained shuttered, doors locked, and only the occasional whispering voice broke the silence. Clara walked through the village, her heart still pounding from the dream that had haunted her the previous night. She tried to rationalize, to convince herself it was coincidence, that the dream had been a nightmare, but the evidence was too real. Mr. Holloway's sudden death mirrored the vision she had seen. The forest, the fog, the shadows she had not imagined them. She reached the square and noticed her neighbors gathered in small groups, faces pale and anxious. Every conversation was broken by fearful glances. Even the baker, normally cheerful, avoided eye contact and murmured quietly to himself. Clara approached her best friend Sophie, who had been standing near the fountain, her hands clenched tightly around the straps of her bag. "Sophie," Clara said softly, "did you have a dream last night?" Sophie flinched. I don't know. I mean, yes, but it was just a nightmare, right? Everyone's having nightmares these days." Clara shook her head. "Not just nightmares. I saw Mr. Holloway, and he's dead, in real life." Sophie's eyes widened. She whispered, almost breathless, "I saw him too. And my father. He was in the trees. He's gone this morning." A chill ran down Clara's spine. It wasn't just her imagination. Everyone in the village seemed caught in the same cycle. Dreams were no longer private, they were shared, interconnected, and lethal. By afternoon, whispers had spread. Families huddled in their homes, doors bolted, windows tightly shut. People avoided each other in the streets, fearful that even a casual mention of the dream could summon the shadows again. Clara and Sophie decided to investigate further. They visited Mrs. Langley, a gentle woman known for her memory of old village lore. Mrs. Langley's hands trembled as she poured tea for them. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said quietly. "I've seen it too. The forest, the fog, and all those faces. My husband, he appeared last night, and this morning." Her voice trailed off. and Clara felt a wave of pity and fear. "Do you think it's the dream that's killing them?" Clara asked. Mrs. Langley nodded solemnly. "I've never seen anything like it. Everyone here, everyone who sleeps, sees the same vision, and those who appear in it do not wake up alive." The girls exchanged a glance. The pattern was undeniable. Mistwood had become trapped in a shared nightmare, a spectral force that reached into the real world with deadly precision. That night, the village was on edge. People sat in candlelit rooms, clutching one another, staring at the shadows outside their windows. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering who would be the next victim. She had already begun to notice small signs of the dream creeping into reality. Fog curling unnaturally around lampposts, shadows flickering at the corner of her vision, and a low whisper that seemed to follow her from room to room. She closed her eyes, trying to resist sleep, but exhaustion overtook her. Soon, she was drifting into the dream once more. The forest returned, darker and thicker than before. The fog rolled like waves, swallowing the ground and twisting the skeletal trees. Clara stepped carefully, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet amplified in the eerie silence. Shadows flitted just beyond her vision. Human shapes. She recognized neighbors, friends, family, all pale, all terrified. She saw Mr. Alloway again, his eyes wide, body frozen mid-fall. She wanted to run to him, to warn him, but every step felt like moving through water. Then she saw Sophie, pale and trembling, reaching toward her. "Clara," Sophie whispered. "They're coming. They know we're awake." Cold wind swept through the trees, carrying a chorus of whispers. Next, next, next. The shadows thickened, faces merging into grotesque shapes. Clara realized the forest was alive, watching, calculating. The shared dream was not passive, it was sentient, choosing who would live and who would die. When she awoke, the terror lingered. Sophie was pale beside her, shaking. I saw it again. It's real. It's real, Clara. The dream. It's killing us." Clara nodded, fear gnawing at her chest. She began to understand. The dream didn't just mimic reality. It dictated it. Over the next few days, the village fell into a tense routine. Everyone slept in shifts, afraid to close their eyes for too long. People shared their dreams cautiously, piecing together the forest, the fog, and the shadowy figures. They began marking who appeared in the visions, noting their health, their movements, and their behavior. Clara and Sophie discovered a chilling truth. The dreams followed a pattern. Those who appeared were slowly drained of vitality, becoming pale, listless, and increasingly susceptible to accidents, illness, or sudden death. The village was gripped by paranoia. Friends and neighbors began watching each other, fearing that even a glance could call someone into the dream. Families barricaded themselves indoors at night. The forest at the edge of Mistwood became a forbidden place, the fog creeping toward the houses as if reaching for the villagers. Clara realized that to stop the deaths, she had to understand the dream. It wasn't enough to avoid sleep. Sleep was inevitable. The dream had become part of the village's collective unconscious, a force feeding on their fear and linking everyone's subconscious minds. Sophie suggested they meet with the oldest villagers, seeking knowledge from those who remembered Mistwood's past. Stories emerged. A century ago, a mysterious plague had swept the village, killing indiscriminately. Survivors spoke of a haunting fog and dreams that bled into reality. Mistwood's dark history, Clara realized, was repeating itself, but this time with a supernatural precision. Clara's determination grew. She could no longer be a passive victim. If the forest in their dreams dictated life and death, she had to confront it directly. She began recording every detail she remembered, sketching the trees, the fog patterns, the shadows' movements. Every night she forced herself to remain conscious in the dream, mapping the terrain, noting which figures appeared and when. The stakes were higher than ever. Another death had occurred overnight. A young boy named Tobias had appeared in the dream, and now his bed lay empty, his lifeless body a grim confirmation. Mistwood was descending into a nightmare, and Clara realized that only understanding the dream could save the village. Night fell over Mistwood like a suffocating blanket. The village, once quaint and serene, now seemed hollowed out, every house a tomb waiting for the next victim. Candles flickered weakly through shuttered windows, casting shadows that danced unnaturally on the walls. Even the wind had taken on a sinister tone, whispering through the streets as though mocking the villagers' fear. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, flashlight in hand, scanning the room for any hint of movement. She had spent the entire afternoon recording the details of the shared dream, sketching the forest, mapping the fog, and noting the figures she had seen. Her notebook was filled with frantic lines and half-finished drawings of twisted trees and ghostly shapes. Beside her, Sophie was pacing. "I don't know how much longer we can last like this," she muttered. "Every night the dream changes. The shadows, they're more aware now." Clara nodded grimly. She had noticed it too. The figures in the dream were no longer passive. They moved with purpose, sometimes pausing to watch her, as if testing her reactions. That night, exhaustion overcame her. She lay down, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but she refused to close them fully. Sleep was inevitable, yet she tried to maintain a thread of consciousness, clinging to the awareness that the forest waited. When she finally drifted, she found herself again in the mist-laden forest. The fog was thicker than ever, rolling around the twisted trunks like restless spirits. Shadows moved within it, their forms distorted, faces familiar yet grotesque. Clara recognized some villagers, their expressions blank, their movements jerky. She saw Mr. Halloway's face again, still frozen in terror, but now there were others. Mrs. Langley, Tobias, even the baker's wife. They wandered through the fog, occasionally pausing to whisper to each other in voices too faint to hear. Then, a new figure emerged. Clara froze. It was her mother, standing beneath the skeletal branches, eyes wide, lips trembling as if trying to speak. The forest had claimed her, and Clara's heart lurched with fear. Clara realized something terrifying. Those who appeared in the dream were beginning to manifest behaviors in reality before they died. Tobias, the boy who had appeared and perished, had shown strange signs the day before, staring blankly into space, muttering about trees and shadows. Mrs. Langley's husband had grown silent, distant, repeating fragments of dreams he could barely remember. The village became a tense stage. Families monitored each other obsessively. Any mention of the dream was avoided, for fear that talking about it might call someone else into the fog. Trust dissolved, replaced by suspicion. Clara and Sophie tried to remain rational, documenting patterns, observing who appeared each night, and the order in which events unfolded. Every detail mattered, for understanding the sequence seemed the only way to survive. They discovered that the forest in their dreams was not static. It changed nightly. Some trees moved closer, paths shifted, and the fog sometimes parted to reveal figures that had not yet died. Clara had a chilling thought. The dream was learning. It adapted to their fear and their attempts to map it. Determined to survive, Clara began experimenting. She closed her eyes with intent, forcing herself to remain conscious in the dream. She walked the fog, memorizing landmarks, and tried to interact with the figures. Some reacted, some ignored her, but a few like Sophie seemed aware, their eyes locking onto hers with recognition and fear. Clara realized she might be able to influence events in the dream, perhaps even save those who were in danger. But every action carried risk. The fog reacted violently to deviations, swirling and compressing, pushing her into the shadows. Whispers surrounded her, accusing, mocking, sometimes crying out her name. Clara awoke each morning exhausted, heart pounding, covered in sweat. She could feel the forest lingering at the edges of her consciousness, a malevolent presence waiting for her to fail. The pattern of deaths continued. Each morning brought news news of another villager lost, another bed left empty, another family plunged into grief. Mistwood streets emptied. The remaining villagers barricaded themselves inside. Paranoia ruled. Friends accused friends of inviting the dream, some fearing even a glance at a neighbor could draw them into the forest. Children were forbidden to sleep alone, yet nightmares overtook them regardless. Clara felt the pressure mounting. She understood now that the dream had a purpose. It tested them, selecting its victims, forcing the village to confront its collective fear. But she refused to be passive. She began preparing, keeping detailed logs, memorizing patterns, sketching maps of the forest, and practicing lucidity in her dreams. She knew that if she could learn the forest's rules, if she could navigate it with awareness, she might find a way to stop the deaths. By the end of the chapter, Clara realizes that the forest is more than a dream. It's sentient, aware of the villagers, feeding off fear and testing them. Every figure that appeared in the fog was a warning, a puzzle piece of the larger nightmare. Clara's resolve hardened. She could not allow the village to be destroyed. She had to enter the dream fully conscious, confront the forest, and understand its logic. The survival of Mistwood and perhaps herself depended on it. Clara could no longer wait. Each night brought another death, another face lost to the fog. The village of Mistwood teetered on the edge of despair. Families barricaded themselves, children cried through the night, and whispers of the forest consumed every conversation. She knew she had to act. Sleep could not be avoided, but perhaps, if she remained aware, she could navigate the dream consciously. Perhaps she could learn the forest's rules, uncover the shadowy force behind it, and save her neighbors. That evening, Clara prepared meticulously. She placed a notebook and pen beside her bed, along with a flashlight and a small vial of water, just in case. Sophie joined her, fear etched deep into her face. "We're doing this together," Clara whispered. "We have to stay aware. We have to remember everything." Sophie nodded, hands trembling, and lay beside Clara, eyes open, refusing to close them fully. As darkness fell and sleep claimed them, Clara felt the familiar pull, the gentle tug of the subconscious dragging her into the forest. But this time, she focused. She felt her mind hovering on the edge of sleep and wakefulness, maintaining a thread of conscious thought as the mist surrounded her. The forest emerged, fog curling around skeletal trees. Shadows moved, but now Clara was ready. She walked forward deliberately, memorizing each landmark, noting where the figures appeared. She saw Tobias wandering, lost, and gently guided him toward a faint light between the trees, testing her ability to influence the dream. The shadows reacted, twisting around her, whispering threats and voices both familiar and wrong. Next, next, next. They reached for her, fingers brushing her skin, but Clara held her ground, breathing steadily, focused. Deeper into the forest, the fog thickened. A dark presence loomed at the center, a massive shadow that pulsed with intent, as if it were alive. Clara approached cautiously, senses heightened. The shadow seemed to respond to her every movement, shifting, stretching, testing her resolve. "You're awake," a voice hissed, not loud but deep, echoing inside her mind. "You shouldn't be here." Clara's heart pounded, but she did not retreat. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice steady. "I want to know what you are, why you're killing my village." The shadow quivered, and in the fog, she saw the faces of the villagers, trapped in a spectral loop, their expressions blank, pleading. The forest itself seemed to pulse with their fear. Clara realized that this entity fed on terror, weaving the villagers' dreams into a trap from which it harvested souls. She took a step closer, and the shadow coalesced into a humanoid shape, dark and undefined, with eyes like black pits. Whispers surrounded her, rising in intensity. Next, next, next. Clara focused on the villagers, visualizing their safety. She imagined guiding them through the fog, past the skeletal trees, toward a clearing of light she created in her mind. Tobias and Sophie followed, then others appeared, each drawn to her resolve. The shadow surged, trying to disrupt her concentration, forming jagged branches and spectral hands to block her path. Fear clawed at Clara's mind, but she forced herself to breathe, to center her thoughts. Every step forward weakened the shadow, as the forest responded not to fear, but to courage. Clara realized that the dream was a mirror of collective consciousness, a manifestation of the village's unresolved fear. If she could maintain calm and guide the villagers, she could perhaps dissolve the forest, breaking the lethal cycle. Finally, Clara reached the center. The shadow rose, massive, its presence oppressive, pulsing with the fear of every villager. It hissed, a sound like wind tearing through dead trees, and lunged at her. Clara stood firm. She spoke aloud, words trembling but determined. "You will not take them. I will not let you." The shadow recoiled, a ripple of resistance passing through the fog. Clara reached out, visualizing a heart of light at the forest's center. Slowly, she focused all her energy, channeling courage, compassion, and determination. The fog thinned around the villagers, their forms solidifying, their fear easing, as if a weight was lifted. The shadow writhed, then slowly began to dissolve, absorbed into the clearing of light. The skeletal trees shrank, the fog dispersed, and for the first time, Clara felt the forest retreat, powerless against her resolve. Clara woke gasping, sweat clinging to her skin, the notebook clutched to her chest. Light streamed through the window, mist curling outside, but no shadows lurked at the edges. Sophie stirred beside her, eyes wide, her breath trembling. "Did it work?" she whispered. Clara nodded slowly, still catching her breath. She felt the forest had been pushed back, the dream's hold weakened. But deep in her mind, a whisper lingered, faint, almost imperceptible, like a warning. The villagers, when they awoke, reported their dreams had been different, calmer, lighter, as if a dark weight had lifted. Hope flickered in Mistwood, though Clara knew the forest had not vanished entirely. It was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. The dawn was muted, a pale gray light filtering through the mist that clung stubbornly to the streets of Mistwood. The village had endured countless nights of terror, and the villagers were hollowed, exhausted, and wary. Families huddled inside their homes, children clinging to their parents, eyes wide with fear. The deaths had slowed after Clara's confrontation in the dream, but the threat was far from gone. Clara sat at the edge of her bed, notebook open, recording every detail of the previous night's dream. She had seen the shadow weaken, the fog thin, and the villagers' forms stabilize, but she knew that partial victory was not enough. The dream had a will of its own. It could return, stronger, smarter, and deadlier. Sophie stood beside her, hands shaking. "Do you really think we can end it?" Clara looked out the window, fog curling around the lampposts. "We have to. Tonight, I'll go deeper. I'll find its heart and confront it fully. It's the only way." That night, the village was eerily quiet. The usual whispers and shuffles were absent, replaced by a tense stillness that pressed on every window and door. Clara lay down, her eyes refusing to close fully. Sophie joined her, ready to maintain awareness with her, a thread of consciousness connecting them through the darkness. When sleep finally took her, Clara felt the familiar tug of the dream, stronger than before. She plunged into the forest, but this time she did not wander aimlessly. Every tree, every shadow, every wisp of fog was etched into her memory. She guided the villagers through the winding paths, avoiding the skeletal trees and the deep pockets of mist that could trap them. The forest seemed aware of her intent. Shadows twisted violently, forming grotesque figures, whispering threats. Next, next, next. Clara pressed forward, focusing on the heart of the forest, the source of the dream's power. At the center of the forest, the shadow waited, larger than before. It pulsed pulsed with the accumulated fear of every villager. Faces of the dead floated in its form, their expressions frozen in terror. The entity exhaled a low, resonant hum that made the air thicken, fog swirling like living smoke. "You are persistent," it hissed, voice like cracking ice. "You cannot save them all." Clara's heartbeat raced, but she stood firm. She focused on the villagers she had guided: Sophie, Tobias, Mrs. Langley, the remaining survivors, and projected her resolve outward. She imagined a light, small at first, growing steadily at the forest's center. This light represented courage, hope, and the collective will to survive. The shadow lashed at her, tendrils of darkness reaching, trying to envelop her in fear. Clara felt their cold brush against her skin, the pressure of every loss, every terror she had witnessed in the village. But she held the light in her mind, pushing outward with all her strength. The fog recoiled. The skeletal trees shuddered, their branches twisting back. Faces of the villagers became clear, solid, and alive. One by one, those trapped in the forest were freed, guided toward the clearing of light Clara created. The shadow shrieked a sound that seemed to tear the air itself, but it weakened under the force of Clara's resolve. The heart of the forest pulsed violently, then began to collapse inward, the fog evaporating, the skeletal trees shrinking to normal size, and the voices of the dead fading into silence. Clara felt a surge of relief, but remained cautious. The forest was sentient, a predator of fear, and could not be destroyed, only contained. She concentrated all her energy, willing the shadow to dissipate completely, focusing on guiding the villagers safely to the edge of the forest, where the dream and reality merged. When the last figure crossed the threshold, Clara felt the forest recoil, then vanish like mist in the sunlight. Clara awoke, gasping, sweat soaking her nightdress. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting golden rays across the floor. Sophie sat beside her, eyes wide, tears streaking her pale cheeks. "It worked," she whispered. They're safe." Clara nodded slowly, still catching her breath. She could feel the lingering presence of the forest, faint but no longer oppressive. Mistwood was intact, its people alive, though wary. Families emerged from their homes cautiously, sharing stories of dreams that were lighter, gentler, less threatening. The pattern of deaths had stopped. The village slowly returned to a fragile peace. Clara and Sophie became silent guardians of the collective memory, keeping watch over sleep and dreams, ready to guide the villagers should the forest ever return. Weeks later, Mistwood was calm, though a persistent fog still curled along the edges of the village. Life returned to a semblance of normality, but Clara never forgot the faces in the mist, the shadow that pulsed with fear, or the whispered warning, "Next, next, next." Clara often stood by the window at night, watching the fog drift through the lampposts, wondering if the forest was merely resting, waiting for another chance to test the village. She knew the dream had not vanished completely. It had only been contained. And sometimes, when sleep crept over her, she swore she could hear faint whispers calling her name, a reminder that the line between dream and reality had been crossed, and that vigilance was the only thing that kept Mistwood alive. The villagers lived on, cautious, watchful, forever aware that even in peace, the fog might one day